A gilded hall filled with murmurs and clinking crystal held a secret no one expected to purchase. In a city of glass towers and desert nights, a single mother sat at a small table, clutching a faded photograph as if it were a lifeline. She signed away a stretch of her life to pay for rent and medicine, and did not know that the man who raised his bidding paddle would turn her world inside out. Before we begin, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and whether you think money can ever buy forgiveness. Now follow the story of Amina and Rashid. The auction room smelled of perfume and cigar smoke and lemon cleaner. Chandeliers threw pale gold over faces used to decision and privilege. Amina Saleh had arrived with the weight of 2 months of unpaid rent in a plastic folder and a small photograph of her son tucked into her palm. The lot being sold was not jewelry or land, but an arrangement that read like a contract for time. She did not want to be here. Her hands trembled with the residue of flour from the bakery shifts that kept her son fed. When the auctioneer read the terms aloud, the crowd chuckled, then leaned forward. Rashid Al Qamar raised his paddle in a movement that made cameras flash. His voice was calm when his assistant, Jaber, announced the final number. Amina felt the floor tilt beneath her when she heard the sum. The contract required periods of relocation and an exchange of custody rights for a set time. She signed because the rent was overdue and the hospital bills for her mother were not going to wait. She signed because when your child is hungry, promises are not enough. The paper was thin, but its consequences were deep. Outside, a taxi hissed into the night. Inside, a man whose name was already in society columns had just altered 2 lives. Amina believed she was buying breathing room. Rashid believed he was securing an heir to place his name upon. Neither imagined what the heart would do after signatures were inked. The drive from the auction hall to Rashid Al Qamar Estates cut through neon and dunes. The motorcade rolled past fountains lit like sapphires and into gates guarded by uniforms and cameras. Amina watched the city shrink in the rearview mirror as Omar, the estate driver, kept a steady silence broken only by the hum of tires and the distant call to prayer. The manor smelled of polished wood and lemon oil and the faint musk of leather. Amal, the housekeeper, greeted Amina with hands that smelled of orange soap and a voice that was softer than the chandelier light. Dr. Samir, the estate physician, performed a set of routine checks within an hour. He explained the medical oversight in precise words, a short clinical list about baseline blood panel tests and an ultrasound for overall health and to establish a screening. Medical record. The process required consent, a signed medical release, and a short period of observation for stress markers. The tests were standard, the results normal, but every clip of the monitor felt like a countdown. Amina was guided to a small room overlooking a garden, where the roses smelled faintly of citrus and the air was cool enough to feel alien against her skin. Her son, Sami, slept that night to the sound of a neighbor's television and a thin fan. In the mansion, she was given a room that had a bedspread heavy with embroidered patterns, a mirror the size of the wall, and glow from bedside lamps that suggested safety. She tried to imagine safety. She tried to imagine a life where bills did not stalk her. Days at the manor arranged themselves into a new and uneasy rhythm. Amal brought soup at noon that tasted faintly of cumin and basil. Omar knocked lightly before arriving to drive errands. Jaber managed the schedules and spoke with a voice that clipped at edges. Each morning Amina walked the long marble corridor to a breakfast table where glass pitchers sweated. Security cameras blinked like small neutral eyes. Rashid did not appear for days. When he finally entered the dining room, he moved with a kind of quiet that indicated habits of command. His suit was always slightly rumpled at the cuff, as if he had no time for small details. He greeted her with a formal nod and left again. The house became a place of observation more than belonging. Amina read in the guest library and sometimes hummed an old lullaby she did not realize she still remembered. She found a patch of sun in the garden and rubbed the tiny scar on her wrist where a metal ring had once bitten her decades before. The staff respected distance, but Amal would sometimes leave fresh bread by the door with a folded note that said, "You are not alone." Those small gestures were soft threads in a vast room. Slowly, small moments shifted the geometry between them. Amina watched Rashid in the library when he could not see her observing. He carried himself like someone always calculating. He paced sometimes at midnight on the terrace, and the sound of his shoes on stone could be heard in the halls. Rashid had a habit of leaving half-drunk cups of coffee on low tables and sticky notes with numbers. One evening, after a storm that left the garden smelling of wet dust and fresh thyme, Rashid found Amina by the greenhouse, her fingers in the soil of potted herbs. He asked without ceremony why she had come to the auction. Her voice cracked with an economy of explanation. She spoke of late rent, of a child who counted spoons each night to measure food, of a mother whose diabetes had surged, and debts that grew like vines. He listened, hands folded, eyes distant, and a single grain of rain on his eyebrow. That night they spoke for the first time for more than a sentence. He asked about Sami, as if asking would conjure him into the room. She answered and described small things a father might not have known the child loved. The way his ears folded when he laughed, and how he collected tiny stones. Rashid did not soften in the way she expected. Instead, he asked about lineage and legacy with a sharpness that felt like knife-light. The conversation was a dance of facts and feelings. For both, there was a strange, unspoken test of trust. Backstory for Amina grew like a small country inside her words. She had been 20 when she married a quiet man named Hassan, who taught her to roll dough into impossibly thin sheets. They had a modest bakery stall near the mosque and worked until the stars came out. The bakery smelled of yeast and sugar and the tang of golden pastry. When Hassan died in a traffic accident, she was left with Sami, who was 2.5, and the bakery to manage alone. Friends helped at first, but debts grew. She worked double shifts, waking before dawn to knead and late into the night to wash counters. She learned to close her eyes for a moment on cold mornings to push herself forward. There were nights she counted coins under the counter, fearing the clink that would not appear. She kept Hassan's old watch in a tin box and sometimes pressed it to her chest when sleep would not come. She took odd jobs, mending scarves, clearing neighbors' stairways, delivering bread to an elderly woman named Fatima who lived across the street. These small acts kept her afloat until the hospital bills for her mother, who had diabetes and a silent heart condition, began to swallow their savings. Amina applied for loans and was rejected. She sold some jewelry Hassan had given her, and then her small savings vanished. When she read about the auction, it sounded like a last crooked bridge across a rushing river. She signed because it was a rope that might hold. Her backstory is a map of work and hunger and the kind of stubborn courage that has no theatrics but deep punctures in the bones. Rashid Al Qamar carried his own private history in the spaces between meetings. The heir to a conglomerate that built bridges and towers, he had been raised in a suite of expectations. His father, Karim Al Qamar, had taught him that family name was leverage and that continuity mattered more than questions of tenderness. As a child, Rashid had been sent to boarding schools where discipline shaped him into decisiveness. He had an arranged engagement once that dissolved when the woman refused to live his life scripted by a boardroom. He buried in his chest a quiet ache over a son he had lost in a custody battle decades earlier with a woman who had fled to another country. That loss had hardened him against frivolity and tenderness. He believed in plans and pedigrees and the efficient purchase of outcomes. Yet he had a soft spot no one expected. Once, when a worker at a plant collapsed and Rashid learned she had been unpaid for months, he quietly arranged a payout and did not tell anyone. He kept a small photograph worn at the edges of his own father in a coat that smelled faintly of tobacco and orange zest. That photograph was folded twice and kept in a wallet he never opened in public. Rashid moved like a man who had learned to armor his feelings and to trade an influence. He was not a cartoon villain. He was a man with a ledger for pain and a ledger for profit, and he would discover that ledgers do not account for surprises. Tension first snapped at a family reunion that Amina insisted on attending in her old neighborhood. She took a day pass and carried a small plate of stuffed pastries back to the neighbors. There was a child in the courtyard who looked like Sami, and the resemblance pulled at something raw inside Rashid. Amal had warned her to be careful. On the way back to the manor, a journalist named Yasmin tracked Amina and pushed an intrusive microphone. Yasmin wanted to trace the story of the auction for a column about modern patronage. Her questions were direct and the recorders were eager. A photograph surfaced, a grainy image of Sami playing at the edge of a fountain on a day when Amina swore she did not go out. Rashid saw the photograph in a morning briefing and his attention leapt. He asked for details with a voice that was suddenly personal and a touch of alarm. The photograph suggested a connection that clashed with the initial terms of their agreement. For Rashid, the possibility of a different bloodline or of an unknown claimant was a threat to his plans. For Amina, it was a cathedral of small fears. The confrontation that followed had voices raised in the kitchen in the early hours, plates rattling, Amal listening from the doorway with flour on her hands. The moment stretched and then broke into a breach of trust. The discovery of a photograph in an envelope on Rashid's desk changed the whole calculus. The photograph showed Sami being held by Hassan at a festival 3 years earlier. The pattern on Sami's ear matched a birthmark that Rashid had been told his own family had carried. Rashid demanded answers. Amina said there were no secrets, that Hassan had been the boy's father, and that she had no other partners. Friends like Layla, who had stood by Amina through bakery closures and nights of silent worry, rushed to defend her. Farid, the neighbor who had once offered his roof to dry laundry, vouched for the timeline and swore by the mosque that Hassan was gone. The argument in the study between Rashid and Amina included shouted questions and long silences, where each breathed into the space as if oxygen itself was contested. Rashid accused her of hiding family ties that might impinge upon the inheritance he sought to shape. Amina accused him of treating her life like a ledger item. Amal cried in the kitchen, and Dr. Samir sat at his desk with hands folded, a note of procedural calm. Yasmin called Rashid for comment, and the estate put a polite, measured statement out to the press. The staff huddled in corners, whispering of contracts and morality. The tension that day was a wound that would not close easily. After the breach, contracts were re-examined. Rashid summoned Rana, his lawyer, and the two of them moved with legal precision. Rana read clauses aloud that sounded like foreign poetry to Amina. The contract allowed supervised visitation rights and financial provisions if certain conditions were met. There were technical provisions about custody law in the jurisdiction and specific sections about temporary guardianship and medically necessary care. A legal clause required notarized consents and a schedule of services provided by the estate. The procedural explanation included phrases about temporary guardianship under civil code articles and a specification of municipal paperwork. Revision meetings took place in the glass conference room with city council forms spread across a table like leaves. Amina was offered amendments that would let her return to her neighborhood more frequently and guaranteed a monthly stipend. The numbers on paper were solid numbers, but the soul of the matter remained unsettled. For Rashid, the possibility that Sami might complicate an eventual heirship was a threat he did not want but could not dismiss. For Amina, the contractual language was both a shelter and a cage. The legal process gave them structure but not comfort. There were visits home that tested everything.
Rashid, reading schedules and privileges, arranged supervised visits to the bakery where Sami had first learned the feel of dough. The air in the bakery smelled of butter, and the long wooden counter held scars of 100 mornings. Sami ran his fingers along the grain of the table and laughed when a neighbor named Fatima swatted his head lightly for stealing a pastry. Rashid waited outside mostly, watching in a silver SUV, while Amal and Layla stood like sentinels. The first visit was quiet and awkward. Sami ran to his mother and then looked around, as if verifying that the smell of yeast belonged to memory and not to a new life. The camera of Yasmin's column had found the bakery again, and there was a photograph published that week that showed a small hand pressed to the glass of a showroom and eyes that held a question. The reaction online was mixed. Some readers praised Rashid for his generosity. Others condemned the auction as a spectacle. Comments poured in, and Amal sat up late and read them aloud with a trembling chuckle in her throat.
The visits deepened a fragile trust, but also opened fissures. Rashid grew softer in small increments. He bought Sami a small, hand-carved toy truck and watched him with a tender impatience that surprised even himself. There were scenes of laughter and small fights about schedules and the meaning of home. A major crisis emerged when an old guardian letter surfaced suggesting that Hassan had once been promised a small position in one of Rashid's foundations by a distant relative. The letter was ambiguous and raised old claims about legacy and precedent. A group of distant relatives surfaced in the press with murmured accusations and a taste for scandal. The estate found itself under scrutiny. Rashid felt the pressure of shareholders and the potential shadow of litigation. In a tense night meeting that filled the conference room with the smell of cold coffee and paper, Rashid and Rana argued about moving quickly to secure a legal clarity. Rashid's voice was low and urgent. He feared a challenge that would disturb the arrangement that had been set. Amina watched from the doorway, her heart in a tight fist. At that moment, she understood the stakes were bigger than her fear. She also understood she had to choose between secrecy and a truth that might free them all. She went to Rashid and asked simply, "Can we find the truth together?" His initial reply was clipped, then softer, then a pause where the two of them looked at each other as if across a chasm. The tension here was a snap that revealed what was important to both. The hospital scene was precise and sensory, and would shape the arc to its highest tension. Amina arrived at the private hospital for a scheduled procedure 2 weeks later. The corridor smelled of antiseptic and jasmine. Nurses shifted in muted blues, and the distant beeping of monitors threaded through the air like small, anxious birds. Dr. Samir explained step by step what would happen during the observation and possible delivery window. He spoke of contractions monitored by tocodynamometry, of the possibility of an induction protocol if necessary, and of neonatal assessments upon arrival. The medical description was clinical and clear. The procedure steps included insertion of a monitoring belt, periodic checks of fetal heart rate, a line of IV fluids if dehydration occurred, and a readiness for cesarean delivery if the fetal distress signs appeared. Each stage required consent, and each signature was recorded in the medical file. The surgical team would prepare with sterile technique, scrub with chlorhexidine, and maintain aseptic fields. This explanation, concise and technical, provided reassurance and also framed the seriousness of what they were about to enter. The smell of lemon and disinfectant flattened Amina's senses into a focused ache. She gripped Rashid's hand and felt the texture of his skin, rougher than she had imagined. The contraction that preceded the birth came like a wave that left her breathless. Dr. Samir stayed calm and direct. The sounds in the room were a low rush of breath, the distant shuffling of shoes, and the occasional tap of a monitor. Rashid rubbed her arm with a stiffness that suggested both fear and unfamiliar tenderness. When the moment arrived, the theater lights were bright and white, and the air tasted like metal and sterilizing agent. Nurses murmured in quick professional phrases, and a maid who would later be Amal stood by with a small towel with a scent of lavender. The baby arrived with a cry that punched through the room like a bell. Sami was born with a small tuft of hair and fingers that grasped the air. Rashid cried once in a sound that surprised everyone into silence. The contract that had bound them in ink faced a new test. Amina, exhausted and exhilarated, looked at the small face and thought of Hassan, smiling in photographs she kept folded in her wallet. The decision came slowly and then clear. Rashid walked to the nurse's station later and found the contract in his briefcase. He took out a pen and began to draw a line through clauses that had felt like chains and wrote new words in their place. He could have enforced the letter of the agreement. Instead, he chose to open it, to add clauses that allowed for shared custodial rights, and to create a trust that would ensure support without possession. He called Rana and asked her to prepare a new contract that named both mother and benefactor as co-guardians, and that included phrases about education and freedom and respect. The paper felt different then. It was still paper, but it was a document reformed by witness and by choice. The rebuilding of trust that followed had days of awkwardness and small triumphs. Rashid attended school plays in the unaccustomed back row and clapped with the rest of the parents. Amina, who had once measured kindness by coins, learned to accept help without humiliation. Amal and Omar and Jaber became allies in a choreography of care. Farid and Fatima and Layla came by often, and the house began to hold the creased laughter of a larger circle. There were administrative visits to the municipality to update records and statements to be notarized as part of the new arrangement. The technical description of the legal revisions included the filing of a new guardianship form with the civil registry and a notarized amendment to the original contract. The amendment specified rights to visit, stipends for education, and procedures for dispute resolution mediated by an independent arbiter. Rana drafted a clause that included mandatory mediation before any court filing, and a clause for community outreach that ensured the estate would fund a local children's literacy program. These changes were small legal instruments, but they translated to concrete safety for Sami and a path forward for Amina. But the true heart of the change came not in paper, but in small domestic scenes. Rashid learned where Sami liked to have his hair combed and how he folded his napkin. Amina learned to ask for time to go back to the bakery when a rush came in the afternoon. They argued sometimes about schedules and overprotectiveness and about who could discipline. Those arguments were real and messy and human, and they brought them closer. Yasmin, a journalist, published a follow-up that did not revel in scandal but told of reconciliations and the ways that public power could be used to do private good. The article described the new foundation Rashid had launched in his father's name and the bakery program that provided apprenticeships to single parents. Public opinion shifted in gentle waves. Not everyone was convinced of redemption, but more people began to ask whether a contract could be repurposed into a promise. At a pivotal moment, an elder named Fatima organized a small dinner in the neighborhood where the crowd filled the courtyard with lamps and the scent of simmering lamb. Rashid showed up unannounced, carrying a tray of pastries from Amina's bakery, and the courtyard hummed with surprised approval. He moved through the crowd with an awkward grace, speaking quietly with people who had known Amina since before she had been fragile with worry. He apologized in a way that was neither theatrical or grand, but honest, and Amina accepted in a way that was patient and careful. The scene became a small public catharsis. It was not a complete erasure of old power dynamics, but a moment when both the wealthy and the working class shared a table and spoke. The housekeeper Amal dried her eyes and joked about how the pastries were the real currency. The final legal step included a public signing of the amended guardianship, where Rashid and Amina both placed their palms on a document that now read like a covenant of support and respect. Jaber arranged flowers and Rana read the clauses aloud to ensure transparency.
The press attended, but the focus shifted from spectacle to the concrete clauses about education funds and guaranteed time for family. The ceremony was unlikely and small. It included the planting of a lemon tree in the garden of the manor to mark the new beginning. The ceremony smelled of citrus, and the soil was loose underfoot, and the sound of a small child laughing filled the air. The epilogue is told in 3 time points and shows a slow and visible transformation. 1 month later, Amina had returned to the bakery for 3 days a week with a schedule agreed by both parties. Sami slept in his small bed in Amina's apartment and visited the manor on alternate weekends. The bakery thrived, and the small sign in the window read "Amina and Sons" as a quiet boast. Rashid had established a fund for community apprenticeships and spent spare evenings reading with the children at the library that the foundation now supported. The lemon tree in the manor garden had 2 new shoots, and Amal would
often bring a small slice of lemon cake to the staff room as an offering. 3 months later, the trust fund was active, and the municipal records had been updated. Rashid publicly announced the foundation in a small ceremony, where he spoke of learning from the people he met and of the responsibility of legacy, to serve, not to own. Amina hosted a small open day at the bakery, where she taught pastry rolling to women who had been referred by the foundation. The bakery doubled as a classroom for the apprentices, and the television station ran a short piece about how policy and compassion could intertwine. Yasmin wrote another column that focused on the system changes that had followed from the case. The community programs included literacy and a small microloan project named after Hassan, the deceased father, whose memory lingered in small photographs. 6 months later, there was a quiet wedding-like celebration in the small chapel on a hill, where the congregation was mostly neighbors and staff, and a few family members of Rashid who had grown to appreciate the human contours of change. It was not a marriage in the legal sense of combining estates and titles, but a promise between 2 people to keep shared guardianship and to attend to the child with equal parts affection and freedom. The celebration included a modest ceremony and a feast where the food tasted of cardamom and saffron and the perfume of jasmine. Sami, now older in ways that do not require numbers, ran between tables with a wooden truck and a laugh that belonged wholly to him. Rashid and Amina stood together and planted another tree, a small olive, that would in time shade a new generation. The guests cheered, and the camera caught a moment when Amina looked at Rashid and said softly, "Thank you for trusting me with my son, and for learning to trust him too." He smiled in a way that was open and not guarded, and the crowd exhaled. The conclusion is simple and true. From the panic of the auction to the quiet of a hospital room and then to a garden with 2 trees, the arc closed into something that felt like a new language for both of them. Rashid redefined legacy to mean service rather than possession. Amina found a dignity that was not for sale. The bakery became a small hub of opportunity, and the house, once known only for its marble corridors, became a place where neighbors were welcomed to the garden. Amal kept her apron and her wry laughter and said that people change when given reasons and space to do so. The community programs now supported other single parents and offered micro-grants to start small ventures. If you were moved by this story, please write in the comments the city where you are watching and whether you think contracts can ever become promises. If this story touched you, subscribe to follow more real stories. About choices and second chances. The last image is of Sami with soil on his small hands, planting his own seed beside the lemon tree. It is a tiny proof that some deals can turn into new beginnings, and that love learned by accident can become the anchor of a family.